Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Estrada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 13 on Artificial Intelligence and Autonomy. So we're in the last unit of the course, and the last theme is on artificial intelligence. In Lesson 12, I gave a long and overwrought lecture on artificial intelligence, introducing the philosophical and ethical aspects in a very general way. So these last two lessons, Lesson 13 and 14, which are the last two content lessons for the course, will be focused on different aspects of artificial intelligence. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about autonomy, how autonomy is relevant to AI, and in particular how it shows up in military contexts and weapon systems, and in civilian contexts in self-driving cars, drones, aerial vehicles, and so on. I have a couple of readings, one from your textbook talking about military technologies in general, and I think it mentioned something about artificial intelligence on page 259. I also have this study by Roth and Moyes in 2016 on autonomous weapon systems. I have an article from Patrick Lynn, 2016, on why ethics matters for autonomous cars. And then I have some optional readings. I have a bunch of other resources in the lecture video. Let's go ahead and start by reminding us from Lesson 12. At the very end, I talked a little bit about autonomy. This is really related to the Lovelace objection. If you remember the discussion on can machines think, Lovelace says that machines only do what we tell them to do. And Turing tries to respond by discussing learning machines. And the discussion of learning machines is supposed to point towards a way of thinking about machines as autonomous, as independent of our programming, as doing things other than what we tell them to do. So the word autonomy comes from the Greek. Auto means self, and nomos is the word for law. So autonomy is something like self-law-giving or self-governing, self-controlling, something that has that governs itself. So autonomy, the discussion often appears in a political context. This is just from the Google define autonomy. So in a political context, a state or a country is autonomous when it has the right to govern itself or when it's capable of self-legislation. This is in a political context. Also, autonomy comes up in discussions of things like rights, sovereignty, independence, freedom. And in moral philosophy, especially related to deontological ethics, which in this class we should remember from, I think, Lesson 6, or maybe Lesson 5. No, Lesson 5. Deontological ethics in Kantian moral philosophy is about rights and duties, and in Kant, rights and duties in particular attached to rational moral agents. Rational moral agents are characteristically autonomous in the sense that they can decide on their own actions, choose their own ends, and in general decide the direction of their own lives. So being autonomous is fundamental to being a moral agent in the philosophical world. And this sort of puts philosophers and roboticists in something of a discursive tension. The way they use these terms are in tension, in particular the way they use the term autonomy. So for philosophers, as I said, autonomy is fundamental to personhood. To have personhood means that you're a full moral agent, and so that you can be responsible for your actions. To be clear, this means that not all human beings are persons. So a person is a full moral agent, fully responsible for their actions. Not all humans are persons, and maybe not all humans are persons all of the time. So, for instance, children are typically not held fully responsible for their actions. If a 5-year-old, accidentally grabs a gun from a locker and shoots someone, it's not the 5-year-old being devious or malicious. The 5-year-old just doesn't know any better. The responsibility there is with whoever left that gun case open, whoever left that child in reach of that gun, and not the child, right? We don't hold the child responsible because we don't think the child is capable cognitively, intellectually, morally, of being responsible for their own actions. Children are still learning. We usually don't hold people fully responsible until they're adults, or at least until we feel it's okay to treat them as adults. We sometimes have age barriers like 18 for voting or 21 for drinking, 25 for renting a car. But these numbers are pretty arbitrary. Your brain continues to develop until your late 20s. So dividing who are the agents at some age, people also develop at different rates, right? So the numbers that we use here are a little bit arbitrary, but the general idea is that there's some distinction between the moral responsibility of children and the moral responsibility of full adult persons. Similarly, for people maybe with certain mental disabilities, maybe persons who are in the grips of intoxicating substances that make them not reason correctly, right? There's all sorts of situations in which persons might fail to have full moral agency, or humans might fail to have full moral agency. So by human, I just mean the biological sort of species, and we're all humans, even children are human beings, but they're maybe not persons in this philosophical sense. And philosophers think that moral agency, personhood, is important, and autonomy is important to personhood because persons can be held responsible for their actions, and that requires that their actions are free in some sense, or autonomous in some sense, that they're not compelled or forced from some outside party, that they are genuinely issued from the agent themselves. Because it's the agent who's themselves making a rational decision for action, that means that the agent can be held responsible for their actions, responsible in the sense that they that they're morally accountable, that they're culpable, that they're liable for those actions. This might cash out in terms of praise and blame, that a moral agent, if they're responsible, they deserve praise when they do something good, they deserve blame when they do something bad, maybe punishment also, or maybe some award if they do something good. But the idea is that moral responsibility entails genuinely deserving praise and blame. Sometimes people get praise and blame for things they don't deserve, but moral responsibility is genuine desert. So in order to deserve praise and blame, you have to have freely chosen your action, and so autonomy and personhood is central to moral responsibility in general. This is at least on a Kantian kind of framework. So that's how philosophers have been talking about autonomy for a few hundred years. Over the last few decades, roboticists have been talking about autonomy in a much more limited sense. For roboticists, the important question is how much control and intervention do humans have as the robot is in operation. So autonomy here isn't about personhood or responsibility in any sense. For the roboticist, a system is autonomous when it can perform some action without human intervention as it's in operation, in the moment of operation. So it doesn't matter so much that the robot is designed specifically to do some task ahead of time. The robot is still autonomous if, as it's performing its task, it doesn't require any intervention from a human being. Again, this is a response to Lovelace's objection that machines only do what we tell them to do. To assert that a robot is autonomous is in some sense to say that the robot is doing something other than what we're immediately telling it to do, or other than what we're immediately controlling it to do. So for the roboticist, the prior design isn't a reason to say that a machine's not autonomous. The self-driving cars are autonomous even though they're designed specifically to do those tasks. And part of what that means is that for the roboticist, autonomy isn't really about intelligence or any other human capacity. Autonomy is really just about independence from human intervention. Roboticists are really thinking about putting robots in dangerous situations where human beings can't be. For instance, during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we talked about how underwater robots were the only things that could go to the wellhead to try to clamp down on the oil leak. And those robots had to be semi-autonomous because they were remote controlled, but they had to do certain things autonomously, sort of independent of direct human intervention, because human beings can't be there. Right? So you need these robots to be in situations, performing actions, making decisions, sort of independent of human intervention, potentially. So let's talk about the two examples that we're going to use for this lesson in the military context and in the self-driving cars context. So first, the military. For the last several years, the military has put a lot of money and effort and development into these unmanned aerial vehicles, sometimes called drones. On the left is the Reaper or the Predator drone, with a person for scale. These things are not as big as a plane, but they're bigger than what a person can fit comfortably into. You can click on this little link to go to the Wikipedia page for the Reapers. MQ-9 Reaper, more recent generation of these kinds of drones is the X-45 by Boeing. These are unmanned aerial vehicles. Unmanned vehicles means that they're controlled by a pilot. There are people stationed at base, usually a base in the United States, that's communicating remotely via satellite links or other kinds of wireless technologies to the drones. So the pilots themselves are not putting themselves in any kind of danger. They're basically playing a video game, but using their consoles, they can drop bombs on people on the other side of the planet. So these UAVs are used increasingly precisely because they get the pilots out of harm's way. They're cheaper and less dangerous to deploy than other kinds of conventional weapon systems. But they're still controlled by a human being, by these pilots who are making the decisions moment to moment about what the machine does. You can put the machines in automated mode, but when they go into any kind of bombing mode or attack mode, they're being remotely controlled by pilots. And it's not just a pilot, but the whole chain of command that's in communication with that pilot, directing the how they use force and how they achieve their objectives. Just to stay on this for a little bit of time, drones were really popular during the Obama administration. So this is drone strikes from 2004 to 2012. Drone strikes have continued to fall off recently. I think there's only been one drone strike so far in 2018. But since 2004, when drone strikes began being used during the George W. Bush administration, and then 2008 is when Obama gets elected, and then from 2009 forward is all Obama drone strikes. And you can see Obama used significantly more drone strikes and were significantly more deadly than anything that George W. Bush used, partly because the technology improved a lot, and partly because Obama made drone strikes the centerpiece of his foreign military campaign. There was an event in 2006 where George W. Bush, one of the drone strikes, was supposed to be against a Taliban training school, and in fact it was an actual elementary school with a bunch of children in attendance. It was school was in session, and we accidentally bombed. I think like some 60-some kids died in that one bombing. Bush was not as keen to continue doing bombings for the rest of his campaign, maybe partly because of these unfortunate early bombing strikes. But Obama was gung-ho about it. Obama ramped up the drone program, partly because he wanted to pull out troops, and so instead of diminishing forces, he just transferred force from troops on the ground to these more surgical drone strikes. Something like 10,000 people have been killed. Again, most of that during Obama's administration. Trump has not used drones as often or as frequently as Obama. Now, the justification for these drone strikes is that they're less dangerous, especially to our own troops, than an operation that involved troops on the boots on the ground, right? Putting our own soldiers in harm's way. So it's safer for us to use these drones to attack targets than to not use the drones. So you might think that means that they're more ethical, right? Shouldn't we be using these drones if they're safer for us than putting soldiers in harm's way? So that sounds right, but then you might also think that, well, if we're exposed to less risk by sending these drones out, then maybe we're more likely to do missions we wouldn't do otherwise. Maybe if we had to expose our own troops to some possibility of harm, then we'd be less likely to do these operations, in which case fewer people would die. So on the one hand, you might think that these save lives, and on the other hand, you might think that these pose a greater risk to life. It does, whether it poses a greater risk to life or not, it does certainly kill people. A lot of people who aren't necessarily involved with anything that deserves being killed. Just before we go on to the autonomy stuff, two little art projects on drone strikes. On the left here is Not a Bug Splat. This is an art project that went around to places in, I think, Pakistan, and they printed up large images of people who had died in drone strikes. The drone pilot operators, when they have a successful strike, they call it a bug splat because that's what it looks like when you're looking at it on a camera from a mile up. But these are actual people that you're killing. It's sort of hard to see from the cameras, from the drone's point of view, that these are people. So putting a big picture on the ground, with eyes that are looking up at you to remind you that there are people on the ground, it might be helpful, or at least this is what the artist is doing. Here on the right is another kind of artistic response to the drone strikes. Here's an artist who does folk art in the style of drones. If you're living in Pakistan or Afghanistan and you know what these drones sound like, when they're coming about a mile overhead, there's not much you can do about it, but just hope it doesn't hit you. And this kind of thing deserves art to process. Okay, so you might check those things out. But these unmanned drones are still remote controlled. They're still piloted by human beings. So when we're talking about autonomous weapon systems, or sometimes called LAWS, lethal autonomous weapon systems, these are weapon systems which are not under the control of a human being, especially with regard to the kill decisions, with regard to the deployment of lethal force. So a lot of the discussions over lethal autonomous weapon systems is whether or not it's ethical or safe for these weapon systems to lack meaningful human control. And then maybe some of the theoretical questions is what exactly counts as meaningful human control? How deep into the control loop must the human be? The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots talks about meaningful human control in a way that makes clear that something like human supervision, if it's just like a supervisor overseeing a bunch of killbots, that's not enough meaningful human control. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots specifically wants humans in control over the kill decisions, over lethal decisions. But exactly which operations of the machine count as lethal, or which ones are okay or not okay, to what extent can machines track or target targets without human intervention? Right. So this is still an open question. This stuff still hasn't been fully settled. There's lots of debates about this right now. So just to introduce this debate a little bit more, here's some examples of autonomous weapon systems. Maybe a simplest example is something like a landmine. Landmine is an explosive device that you bury underground, and it detonates when someone walks over it. And these are defensive weapons. They can be very deadly. And they're also the kind of thing that if you leave them underground, you might not dig them up when the war's over, especially if you're the side that lost, which means that these weapons can stay underground for years or decades after a war is over, and someone completely unconnected with that war might end up walking over the landmine and hurt themselves. So this is an example of autonomous weapon system because that landmine is deploying without someone controlling, right? Someone pulling a trigger. That weapon system is deploying on its own in some sense. Now, landmines like this have been used for decades. These are old technologies. They're not particularly sophisticated, advanced technologies using artificial intelligence or anything. But they are autonomous in the sense that they're deploying on their own. And the question is about the ethics of landmines. Right now, international treaty, you can use landmines, but it's a war crime if you don't record and keep track of where you've put all these landmines, so that when the war is over, even if you lose, someone can take your notes and go back and find all these landmines and either and safely get rid of them. So if you don't keep track of where you put your landmines, it's a war crime. And this is by international treaty. This is the Geneva Conventions, UN Conventions. That's a kind of autonomous weapon system. Here's another kind of autonomous weapon system. I think I showed this in the Lesson 12 video, but just to remind you, this is the Samsung SGR1. Samsung, the same Samsung that probably built your phone, is a weapons supplier to South Korea. Samsung, the South Korean company, has been supplying weapon systems to South Korean military, including this automated turret. This turret can identify targets, draws a little box around them. It can track them as they move around, and the original versions of these machines had a setting where they could also initiate. You could set them in an auto-initiate mode where they would not only track and target and track enemies, but they would initiate fire on them. So when these weapons were deployed in South Korea in the demilitarized zone facing north, there was some international outcry. People didn't want these weapon systems just firing on their own. The outcry was that this stuff has to be under human control, that there has to be a person there who can look at the image on the screen and determine whether, in fact, this is a legitimate target or not, so that it has to be a person in charge of that kill decision. Right, so this happened a few years ago, but this was one of the early examples of a debate over autonomous weapon systems. Again, this thing is in particular, this turret is certainly not going to take over the world, and these debates over autonomous killer robots is not, it's not about robots that pose an existential threat to humanity in the Terminator sense. The existential threat here is from weapon systems that go out of control, and especially arms races for these weapon systems. So maybe a more advanced example of technology. This is an LRASM. This is a long-range anti-ship missile. So these are on our big ships in the U.S. They're also commonly deployed with jet fighters. And these big ships have them. So these are missiles, but what makes these autonomous weapon systems in particular is that these are missiles that you fire before you know where your enemy is. So, especially if you're in the Navy and you're firing at a ship that's perhaps on the other side of the horizon, so you don't have a direct line of sight to that enemy, but you have a sense or think that they're in the area over the horizon. You might want to deploy your weapons early and let the weapons get up and high enough so that they can see over the horizon, and then have the weapons themselves do the targeting and acquiring once they can find their target. Right. So the idea here is that the person shooting off the missile doesn't have to know exactly where it's going, and that the missile itself can make last-minute trajectory changes in order to determine what the right target is. So this LRASM, it can do obstacle avoidance, and it can come up to, so this is video of as it's coming into the battle zone. There's different targets, and it selects among those targets by identifying certain features of the ships and so on. So it decides which target to attack, and then it deploys. And again, this is all being done by the machine itself, and not the people who launched it. So these are examples of autonomous weapon systems. So there's a good question about how to distinguish exactly these autonomous weapon systems from the unmanned aerial vehicles, especially because the UAVs can be increasingly automated in various functions. So a few years ago, in 2016, Heather Roth and her colleagues did this major study at ASU where they went through every known weapon system and rated it on a scale of how self-mobile it is, and how much control it had over its own movement, and how much control it had over its goal acquisition. And it ranked all of the known weapon systems. The Neuron is one of these very advanced UAVs that has a lot of autonomous features, and where the line between what the pilot's doing and what the weapon system is doing can get a little bit blurry. So Heather Roth does this study and then writes a report where she makes a bunch of recommendations for how these weapon systems ought to be developed in the future. In particular, she emphasizes that human control in technologies is enhanced when the technology is predictable, when it's transparent, when the user has accurate information, when there's timely human action and capacity for timely human intervention. In other words, where the system makes room for human intervention. And most importantly, where there's accountability to be shared. So it's this last point about accountability that's really the focus of meaningful human control, this discussion of meaningful human control. It might be the case that these weapon systems eventually perform better than human soldiers in the sense that they make less risky decisions, they kill fewer civilians, and so on. But the discussion right now over meaningful human control, the argument is that even if these weapon systems are in some sense safer than human operators, it's important for there to be human operators, not just for safety reasons, but for accountability reasons. You want a human being, to pull the trigger, because if that human being makes a mistake, we know how to hold them accountable. Right? We know how to hold them accountable, blame them, punish them if necessary, remove them from that post, correct the mistakes that human made. But when you take the control out of human hands, then there's no person there to hold accountable, and then you lose some of the control over that system. So I strongly encourage you to look at this report. There's an interactive website with a bunch of these fancy graphs here. It's a very interesting and very detailed report, and I strongly encourage you look at it. This report contributes to a more general political movement, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, or ICRAC, which is the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. These groups work together to lobby governments, state actors, NGOs, and also the UN in order to develop international bans, international treaties against autonomous weapon systems. So this is a ban to stop killer robots in the sense of lethal autonomous weapon systems. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots has been speaking very recently at the UN CCW. This is the Convention on Conventional Weapons. So the UN has a policy venue where different organizations can propose new constraints on ethics and regulations and international treaties. The UN is a forum for these kinds of international treaties to go through. Several kinds of treaties have gone through the CCW, including regulations against chemical weapons, against biological weapons, against nuclear weapons. Chemical, biological, nuclear weapons have all been used in the past, and in some cases, they've all been used in the past, but international consensus is that these kinds of weapon systems are inhumane and that they're against human dignity. Even granting that war is hell, we still agree that certain kinds of actions go too far, especially things like chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons, and we have strong international treaties and regulations over the use and development of these kinds of weapon systems. So the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots wants to develop a similar kind of regulation or treaty against killer robots. In 2015, Elon Musk donated $10 million or $15 million, something like that, to the Future of Life Institute. Future of Life Institute is a think tank that studies existential risk. They spent a lot of time on things like biotechnology, on nuclear weapons, on climate change, existential risks, things that threaten human existence on the planet. And in 2015, Elon Musk gave the Future of Life Institute like $15 million to study artificial intelligence. A lot of that money went to the campaign Stop Killer Robots and other people to do this kind of research and the risks that autonomous weapon systems pose. And in addition to this research, they also published this open letter on autonomous weapon systems. Let me blow this up a little bit. This is an open letter signed by several major names in AI research. These are all of the big AI almost all of the big AI researchers representing almost all of the big AI research institutions, signing this open letter against autonomous weapon systems. Again, they're not worried about Terminators taking over the world or destroying humanity. What they're worried about is another arms race, like gunpowder and nuclear arms. The nuclear weapons arms race was bad for humanity. At one point during the peak of the Cold War, we had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over, eradicate all life on Earth. We might still have that capacity now, but there are far fewer nuclear weapons today than there were a few decades ago. So the goal is to prevent a global arms race before it gets going. If we let autonomous weapon systems develop without impediment, they might become the Kalashnikovs of tomorrow. The Kalashnikovs probably have killed, is a weapon that have killed most people in history, AK-47s. They're cheap, they're easy to make, and they're everywhere, and so they're used regularly to kill people. And so the idea is that this could also happen with AI, especially if people work to develop autonomous weapon systems. And so in order to stop this before it gets going, the open letter says, just as most chemists and biologists have no interest in building chemical or biological weapons, so too most AI researchers have no interest in building AI weapons and do not want to tarnish their field by doing so, potentially creating a major backlash against AI that curtails future societal benefits. Chemists and biologists have broadly supported international agreements that have successfully prohibited chemical and biological weapons, just as most physicists supported treaties banning space-based nuclear weapons and blinding laser weapons. So in summary, we believe that AI has great potential to benefit humanity in many ways, and that the goal of the field should be to do so. Starting a military AI arms race is a bad idea and should be prevented by a ban on offensive autonomous weapons beyond meaningful human control. So this has been signed by thousands of people now. I recommend you look at the letter, you look at the campaign Stop Killer Robots, and think about the ethics of artificial autonomous weapon systems. Moving on to autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars especially, we can talk also, if you want to talk in the forums about civilian drones, like quadcopters or civilian drone technologies, or the ethics or regulations around those, that's fine too. I'm going to talk right now mostly about vehicles. In 2005, just for a little bit of history, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is the military, is the research and development wing of the military. DARPA is what funds a lot of the high-tech advances that the military uses. In the 60s and 70s, DARPA funded ARPANET, which eventually became the internet. And for the last few decades, DARPA has been investing millions and millions of dollars into artificial intelligence research, especially in robotics, in autonomous robotics. So in 2005, this is over a decade ago, DARPA funded the Grand Challenge. Grand Challenge was a race in the desert to get these self-driving cars to drive about 170 kilometers through the desert. Let me actually, so you show the desert here. Yeah, so 2005, before this, no one had driven a self-driving car, had built a self-driving car that could go in any reasonable length and a sort of open course like this. In 2004, in fact, DARPA held the first Grand Challenge. Some few dozen cars entered the first Grand Challenge, and none of them got more than 100 meters past the starting line. So all of the cars failed in 2004. So it was a big challenge in 2005. Carnegie Mellon and Stanford put in the big entries, and it was a legitimate race to the very end. I would recommend you watch the Grand Challenge. This is a Nova documentary about the Grand Challenge, and it's really great, partly because it talks to a lot of the roboticists as they're building this. This is back in 2005. A lot of these people ended up getting hired by Google or Uber or any of the other big self-driving car companies in order to build the cars that we've developed over the last 10 years. So this is where a lot of these people got their start. So in particular, this little motorcycle here is built by Anthony Lewandowski. The car is called Ghost Rider. Anthony Lewandowski there's Anthony Lewandowski. He submitted Ghost Rider in 2005 to the Grand Challenge. I don't think he made it through the qualifiers, but he got hired by Google as part of Waymo. Actually, let me show you this. So Anthony Lewandowski was hired by Waymo in 20... so he entered DARPA, and then in 2007, so immediately after the Grand Challenge, he went to go work for Google on their self-driving cars. He worked there for a while, and then he ended up leaving Google to start his own self-driving car company. He ended up getting hired by Otto, and then Otto was acquired by Uber. And when Anthony Lewandowski went to Uber, he took a lot of the patents that he had developed with Google that were owned by Google to Uber. Uber basically started its self-driving car company using stolen intellectual property that Anthony Lewandowski stole. This ended up, he ended up getting fired for this. I don't know what the whether he himself has been sued, but I know that Uber ended up having to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to Google for the stealing of their intellectual property. And this was all from Anthony Lewandowski, who again got his start at the DARPA Grand Challenge in 2005. Just to end the Anthony Lewandowski discussion, after this lawsuit went through and he was fired by Uber and basically lost his status in the AI world, he started going around talking about building an AI god or a religion of AI in order to start worshiping AI. So that's what Anthony Lewandowski is doing now. And again, he got his start in the Grand Challenge. But not just him, a lot of the major players, a lot of the, especially the key engineers developing the most recent round of AI. Just for instance, the DAD vehicle right here, the group that built DAD didn't get very far in this race, but they ended up designing a LiDAR technology that gets used by almost every other group in the future, and they made a ton of money with their LiDAR system. If you like the self-driving car stuff, this is a great place to learn the history. In the Lesson 12 video, I went over the SAE levels of autonomy very briefly. I'm going to go ahead and do that again just very quickly. So the levels of autonomy are ways that the self-driving car community has decided on in order to distinguish the capabilities of these self-driving cars. So SAE is the Society for Automotive Engineers. This is a professional society like the NSPE, the Professional Society of Automotive Engineers, and they set this framework for deciding the level of autonomy of self-driving cars. So this is a framework that goes from 0 to 5, with 0 being no automation and 5 being full automation. And the issue here is really about how much intervention is required by the human. So at level 0, the human can't... I'm sorry, so the more autonomous it is, the less intervention that humans require. So at level 0 autonomy, humans have to do all the work, and the car can't do any of the work. The humans controlling all aspects of the driving task. At level 1 autonomy, the car can control some functions. Level 1 autonomy, something like cruise control. In cruise control, the car can control the speed, and it can be intelligent about the speed, speeding up or slowing down when you're going up and down hills, for instance. So that requires a little bit of sensitivity and adjustment on the part of the car, but otherwise the driver's still doing all the work. When you have it in cruise control, you still have to sit there and drive, or steer, and watch the road around you and so on. The car is controlling one aspect of the driving, but the human's controlling the overall driving task. At level 2, you can put the car into a mode where maybe it controls some more aspects of driving. For instance, like the self-parking cars, where you can drive up to a parallel parking space and then put it in the parallel parking mode, and then the car will do everything else to put it directly in that slot. That's doing more than just controlling one aspect of the car. In order to parallel park, you have to control both acceleration and steering, but the car is only operating in these limited environments, in these limited contexts, and the human is in control of the general driving task. So up through level 2, the human is mostly in control. From level 3 to 5, the car is perhaps the primary controller. So at level 3, it's conditional automation. At level 3 automation, the car can control itself in limited respects, but the human has to be on call, ready to intervene if necessary. So most cars on the road right now are level 2 automation. The Tesla vehicles are sometimes called they're level 3 automation. Tesla vehicles are sometimes called level 2.5, somewhere between 2 and 3. The Tesla vehicles require that a human being is monitoring the car at all times, ready to intervene when necessary, and they struggle in, for instance, bad weather conditions, or if there's construction around, the car might get confused, and so the human has to jump in. For the Tesla vehicles, the human has to be sitting there watching the car at all times. I think it might even beep at you if you take your hands off the wheel. So you can't ignore the car at level 3 automation. You have to be ready to jump in at a moment's notice. Level 4 automation, the car can control more aspects of the driving on its own, and it'll control itself even if the human doesn't intervene. So the human doesn't have to be totally monitoring the car at all times. The Waymo cars are only recently, within the last few months, securing level 4 automation. They're achieving level 4 automation, or they're being rated level 4 by the SAE. But we don't have any level 5 cars yet. So level 4 cars, the human can intervene, but isn't required to at all times. The Waymo cars on the road right now are level 4 automation, and the statistic I know is that they can get something like 5,000 miles of highway driving between each instance of human intervention. So they can drive for 5,000 miles on the highway, which is like several days of driving in between every instance of human intervention. It's pretty good. Level 5 automation is where no human intervention is necessary whatsoever. Maybe there's no interface for human intervention at all. That is just a sort of hollow car shell that people can get into and pass out drunk, and the car can take them where they need to go. So right now we're in maybe between 2 and 4 level automation. We don't quite have any level 5 cars. We're just starting to get level 4 cars. Most of the cars on the road are between level 2 and 3. And this between level 2 and 3 is also the most dangerous form of self-driving cars. When the car requires that the human intervenes or task switch between whatever else they're doing and then taking over for the car. This is very difficult. Even if you're a good driver, if you're distracted from the road, then suddenly taking control of the car, it requires that you situate yourself on the road, that you know where all the cars are around you and what's going on the road around you, especially if the car is asking you to intervene in a dangerous situation. This might require some split-second timing, and if you're not totally prepared to do that, you're not going to perform very well. In general, humans don't perform very well when they have to switch between tasks. This is why you shouldn't have your laptop open during classes, or if you're scrolling through other websites while you're listening to this video. I mean it's fine, but you're compromising your performance on both tasks. You're not learning as much from this video if you're paying attention to other things. And you're also not learning as much about whatever else you're doing. If you're playing a game or whatever, you're going to be playing that game more poorly, right? So humans take a performance hit when they have to divide their attention between multiple tasks. And that's exactly what these level 2 or level 3 cars are requiring us to do, and that's very dangerous. We know in this class, having gone over the Pinto case, that these self-driving cars, that cars are very deadly. They kill people all the time. 35,000 people a year die in vehicle accidents. So we're maybe prepared intellectually for these cars to kill people, but let me just show you some examples of these self-driving cars. This is a Tesla vehicle. You'll see that the person is not steering or moving the gas or brakes at all. The pedals move, but it's not because the person is touching them. So here's the view from inside the cab. And here's what the car itself can see in its cameras. So it's got cameras positioned all around the car. Tesla vehicles use combinations of video, radar, and sonar. Radar and sonar and video cameras. Basically, they overlay these three things on top of each other in order to figure out where the road is, where all the other cars are. You can see it draws little boxes around the other objects that it might need to avoid or be wary of. It can also identify signs and so on. You can see that it's marking the signs slightly differently than it's marking the objects on the road, because it has to read those in order to know what to do and so on. It drives a little bit jerky, but it's obeying all the signs. It's avoiding the things that it should be avoiding and so on. So this is a self-driving car. Again, as I said, the Tesla vehicles do not have any laser detection. They use only sonar and radar. Sonar and radar are okay, but they're very coarse-grained. They don't have very high resolution. So they'll stop before they hit these people, but they're not going to see everything in very coarse detail. You see the boxes that they're drawing around things are pretty big. The more sophisticated technology that we have available is LiDAR, which is laser detection. But in order to do laser detection, you have to have a little spinning laser in your system, shooting a laser out and getting the feedback from the laser. Having a spinning laser that's accurate enough to get data like this is very expensive. This is this little box that you see on the top of these self-driving cars. The Tesla vehicles don't have this box because they don't have a LiDAR system, but this box alone might cost $10,000 of equipment, independent of any of the other car or even the automation stuff in the rest of the car. Just the detectors might be $10,000 or more. This will change in the future. Right now, our LiDAR systems are big and bulky and very expensive. We're starting to develop things like solid-state LiDAR that don't require a spinning laser. When it doesn't require a spinning laser, that reduces costs quite a bit, and it might be in another 10 years, LiDAR systems will fit on a chip, and you won't have these big bulky things on the top. So in some ways, these LiDAR systems on the top of cars might date these self-driving cars. They'll look old because they have these big clunky things on top. That won't be the way forever, but so the Tesla vehicles there's a lot of these on the road, but they don't have the LiDAR system. They're still pretty good. They're doing a lot of things in software, but that doesn't make them entirely safe, and we have had a few fatal crashes with these autonomous vehicles. The first that I know of, the first Tesla fatal crash by a passenger happened in 2016. You can click the link to a New York Times article right here. So the Tesla vehicle was going down Highway 27 down this way. A semi-truck pulled in the left turning lane and turned left right in front of the car. The person who was driving the car must have fallen asleep because the car didn't swerve or slow down at all. It just kept going. The car itself didn't detect that the truck had gone in front of it, presumably because there was a glare that made the car not able to see the white side of the truck. If it was a human, that human probably would have seen that truck and the car wouldn't have crashed. But the driver was asleep, so the car just barreled right through the truck, and the passenger died. So this is the first case of a vehicle crash from a Tesla vehicle. More recently, there was the first case of a pedestrian crash from a vehicle. This is a slightly disturbing video. This is the camera footage from the Uber vehicle that just hit this person. She died from this crash. And let me come back over here. Slow it down a little bit. Yeah, so So it's night. Some of the initial reports were that the woman jumped out in front of the car, but that's clearly not what happened. She was in the road. Now it's hard for us to see, especially in this camera. Maybe the driver would have seen a little bit better that there was a person in the road. Maybe the person wouldn't have walked into the road if she thought that there was a person driving this car and the person would normally slow down. So maybe this is all because she wasn't anticipating what the car was doing. We know the car didn't slow down at all. It didn't even swerve at all. And then the next part of this video is the internal camera of the driver. The driver, it looks like she was on the phone or wasn't paying attention for whatever reason. Yeah, and then at the very end, you can see the panic where she grabs the car. So the car didn't slow down. The logs from the car show that the car didn't detect anything in the road. And this is not how this should happen. The car had laser detection. It also had sonar and radar. It had enough sensors that it should have seen the person in the road, even if the human being couldn't. So the fact that this car didn't do this, didn't stop for the person, is disturbing. Another thing maybe to mention here is that the Uber crash happened in Arizona. So there's no regulations for statewide. For at the federal level in the United States, there's no regulations for how these self-driving cars should operate. Apart from the SAE levels of autonomy, there's no federal regulations on how these cars should operate. What that means is that it's individual states forming their own regulations. So a few states have done this: California, Pennsylvania. California actually has some pretty stringent rules about what these cars have to do in terms of the records that they keep and they have to make available. There has to be a little black box in these cars now so that it records in a reliable way. It records exactly what the cars do at every step of the way before these crashes. So this was California required that cars maintain this data in order for them to be tested and operated on California roads. That not only that they maintain this data, but that the data was made available to insurance and safety inspectors after any crash. Another thing that California required was that the companies testing these vehicles take full liability for anything that goes wrong with these vehicles. So even if the car crashes and it's someone else's fault, that the car manufacturer is liable to some extent for the damages. These were very high regulations that California required for these car companies to test their new vehicles on California roads. Google agreed to the regulations and is still testing their cars on the road. Uber tried testing their cars on the road, and California told them that they had to meet these requirements, and Uber sued. Uber lost that lawsuit, and then Uber was kicked out of California. Uber still ran their tests in other states that allowed them to, and one of the states was Arizona. Arizona was sort of looking at these very stiff regulations in California and was looking at it as an opportunity for them to bring a little revenue, a little Silicon Valley investment money their way. So Arizona, for the last few months, has been touting itself to Silicon Valley as a zero regulation environment. It was the Wild West of self-driving cars, where there was basically no laws about what you had to do, what kind of liability the car manufacturer has, what kind of records they have to keep. Arizona had almost no regulations about these things at all. That makes these cars very unsafe, and that also means that it's a legal and political nightmare when Uber causes this kind of crash, because so now everyone's looking at Arizona for what's going to happen next. What's the policy going to be? What's the standard? What standard is going to be set in the industry? These are policies that are just being settled now. We don't have policies for how these self-driving cars work even now in 2018, right? And so when these kinds of crashes happen, as we've seen time and time again in this class, it's when these safety accidents happen that causes people that forces people to sort of take these issues seriously and start beefing up the regulatory environment. So that's just happening now with self-driving cars. It's also just happening now with civilian drones. If you're interested in these areas, you can get involved right now in the ground floor and start setting policy, start helping to set policy that might affect these domains for years in the future. One last thing to say here is there's questions about what these machines should do in cases of these crashes. So in the Uber crash, the car just didn't see the pedestrian in the sidewalk. But you can imagine cases where the car does see maybe several pedestrians and has options about what it can do. And then the question is, what should we design these machines to do? So, for instance, this is called the tunnel problem in artificial intelligence. The tunnel problem, right? The idea is that you're driving into a tunnel with a steep cliff face on both sides. You drive into the tunnel, very high speed, steep cliff face on both sides. You can't swerve or you'll fall off the cliff. And then like a child runs in front of the tunnel. And so it's either you swerve off the cliff and probably kill yourself and everyone in the car, or you keep driving straight and save the car but kill the child on the road. Right? What do you do in these situations? So this is basically, if you remember the trolley problem from our discussion of consequentialism, this is basically the trolley problem for AI. What should the machine do when faced with two potentially different or potentially equally problematic decisions? Right? Should the car swerve or not? So MIT a few years ago built this website called The Moral Machine. I'll fix this. Called The Moral Machine that is designed to run through these trolley problem simulations. So I'll show you a few of these. So this asks, in this case, if the car goes straight ahead, it'll hit this barrier and kill everyone in the car, and in the car are 3 large women and 1 female executive. Or the car can swerve. When it swerves on the road are 3 large women and 1 female executive. So it's the same people that would die in both cases, the same group of people, or at least same identity categories of those people. It's not the same exact people, but the same identity categories of the people that they're mentioning. The big difference here, though, is that the people who are crossing the street are jaywalking. So is it better for a car to hit the barricade and kill its passengers, or swerve and kill a comparable group of people who are jaywalking? Is the fact that they're jaywalking sufficient reason for the car to swerve and kill them instead of the passengers? I don't know. You can make a decision. I think the moral machine will lead you through 13 of these cases. They'll be different in every case. Here it's, I'm going to go ahead and show the descriptions. Here is one boy. Here it's an elderly man in the car and a boy on the road. The boy is not flouting any laws. So the question is, do you kill the old man or the young boy? There's all sorts of reasons to be worried about the moral machine framing of these kinds of questions. For one, is all the identity categories used are problematic for lots of different reasons. But also, do you want machines to be making these kinds of decisions? There was a controversy with Mercedes-Benz cars. Mercedes is also designing its own autonomous vehicle, and it said in an interview that its vehicles might prefer to save their passengers over any pedestrians around them, which makes sense for Mercedes-Benz because it's a luxury vehicle. The people who buy those cars probably expect that they as passengers will be privileged over the pedestrians around them. Mercedes, so they said that they would privilege the passengers over pedestrians. Mercedes had to walk that back a little bit because it's probably illegal to make life or death decisions that'll deliberately kill pedestrians around you. But there's this important question. It's a safety question. It's a marketing question. There's all sorts of complications that arise from having machines make these kinds of life or death decisions in civilian contexts. So I have, just to close here, this discussion of why ethics matters for autonomous cars. This is an article by Patrick Lynn, who's a lawyer and philosopher, talking about autonomous vehicles. This is a couple of years ago. Patrick Lynn is very deeply involved in the literature on autonomous vehicles. So I'd recommend reading that for some general framing on the ethics debates over self-driving cars. Beyond that, here's a bunch of other resources. Peter Sorrow has this great paper in 2016 about autonomous robots and police force, right? So what happens, so we talked about in military contexts and civilian self-driving cars, but what happens when you take these sort of military robotic technologies and put them in the hands of civilian police forces? Different kinds of questions arise from the military context that are interesting to talk about, and you might want to read Peter Sorrow's talk here. In addition, I have these 3 conferences, recent major ethics and AI conferences that you might think of looking at. This first is the Ethics of AI at NYU. This was in 2015. A bunch of people who are very important in the AI debates gave talks there. These are all YouTube videos. So I think the talks are like a half an hour long. So watch some of these videos. They're all very good. There's more videos at the conference, but these are the sort of selection that I'm recommending. There are also these 2 other conferences that were held this year, the FAT, the Fairness, Accuracy, and Transparency Conference, and the AIES, which is a triple AI conference. Were both earlier this year. They're both great, and they also have more discussion of these kinds of ethical issues about autonomous technologies. And I think I've said enough. I've been talking for a long time, and I should not. I should stop talking now. Write about what's interesting to you from this material. Dive in and do your own research to see what you can learn.